call sign, like we should have done in the first place. But because it was a commercial standard and call signs weren't involved, they had to come up with an idea for how do we label each radio. So initially, and they weren't interlinked. You know, you would get on a repeater and you'd only be talking to people on your repeater. You know, if you were Al's Taxi, you didn't care what Joe the Plumber was doing on the repeater. So having a coordination of numbers didn't matter. You know, the vendor, whoever it was, say Qualcomm used to be a DMR vendor here in town. They would put up a repeater and they would program, okay, Al's Taxi is going to have 1 through 200. Joe the Plumber is going to have 300 through 400. And they didn't need to coordinate the numbers. But then they started building out the system further and interlinking repeaters. Now we need to coordinate numbers. And so that began to happen later on. And when DMR began to appear in the amateur world, the Motorola Amateur Radio Club, one of the largest amateur radio clubs, longest standing amateur radio clubs in the country, they do a lot of DMR work in Motorola. They call it Moto Turbo. They began to say, hey, why can't we make this something that we can use in amateur radio? The FCC approved it. It's not against the rules, as a lot of people had argued for a long time, that you couldn't use any digital voice on amateur radio. And the Motorola Amateur Radio Club, the MARC, began to implement repeaters in their facilities with DMR on amateur radio frequencies. Then they started to link them. And so they set up their own numbering system for that. And because it wasn't designed as an amateur radio protocol, they have the number and not the call sign. See, if it was designed as an amateur radio protocol, how do you identify each other as a hand radio operator? Call sign. I mean, we're all proud of our call signs. But in DMR, because it's a commercial application, the call signs weren't part of it. So you had to get the 7-digit number. And then as it began to grow, DMR Mark then had this worldwide database where you would have to register your call sign and get a 7-digit ID. So we added a layer of complexity to it because it wasn't designed for amateur radio. And DMR Mark did a great job until other users began to come on board and other networks, and then build things where they could have real-time linking to DMR Mark's database, and DMR Mark's database blew up. No longer could you get a new number from DMR Mark. You had to go somewhere else because their database just blew up. And now a third party is maintaining the numbers. Those numbers are part of that data over on the right side that you see that gets transferred. So when you key up your radio, the very first thing that's being sent is data about what talk group you want to talk on, and I'll explain talk group in a minute, and who you are. And then on the other end, shows up on your screen a 7-digit number, and if you're programmed on your handheld for that talk group, your radio will light up. That's all controlled in those first 3 packets. And then the rest of the packets there are the voice data, where it's been converted from audio tones to 1s and 0s that get sent across the wavelength then. And that's essentially how DMR works. So the commercial protocol based on 12.5, CDMA, data stream includes ID, location, and other data. It's also built on tiers. The protocol was standardized for 3 tiers. A couple of years ago when amateur radio was first getting started with DMR, there were a bunch of handheld radios that came out that were really cheap, and repeater owners said, no, you can't use it on my repeater. Because it wasn't a true Tier 2 radio was only a Tier 1 radio. Tier 1 is a protocol that's basically designed for radio to radio. You see somebody working Tier 1, it's from handheld to handheld or mobile to mobile, with no infrastructure involved. And Tier 1 doesn't specify that it has to be TDMA, that it has to be in 30 millisecond chunks, swapping back and forth between slot 1 and slot 2. In fact, most Tier 1 radios just use all 12.5 kilohertz bandwidth. Doesn't make it work any better. But when you use that on a Tier 2 repeater, now you're taking up both both time slots. And the repeater owner said, no, we don't want to do that. Time 2, or Tier 1 was simplex or half duplex, meaning you transmit and receive on the same frequency, or half duplex, you transmit and receive on a different frequency, but you can't transmit and receive at the same time. In most countries, Tier 1 for commercial use is low power and doesn't require a license. Same here in the United States. You can use low power DMR on non-amateur radio frequencies without a license, much like GMRS or FRS. Now, Tier 2 includes infrastructure such as repeaters, but it's not required. You can still go radio to radio in Tier 2, but this is where the repeaters come in, is in Tier 2 protocol. Enforces the TDMA protocol, 2 time slots, switching back and forth every 30 milliseconds. So when the radios first came out that were Tier 1 only, I think the Radiolity GD55, I think, the initial version of that, was a Tier 1 only. And you transmit, you're going to tie up both time slots on the repeater. And some repeaters were actually being forced off the air because guys didn't realize they were taking both sides, both time slots. This is what we would call standard DMR. Tier 2 is the standard DMR that we're all familiar with. You pick up your GD77, your MD380, your Anytone. These are Tier 2 radios. Now there's another tier, and that's Tier 3. To my knowledge, no one has instituted Tier 3 in the amateur radio world yet, because it uses, it includes all the stuff in Tier 2, but it supports trunking. Trunking is a protocol where you have multiple repeaters, multiple frequency sets, and a control channel. So if I want to transmit on my radio, I hit the push to talk button, or what I like to refer to as the release to listen button. And I push that button, and my radio sends on the control channel, sends a signal to the computer that says, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I want to talk on this talk group. And then the control channel sends a signal back and says, okay, switch to this repeater, and you have open space then to transmit. Now that happens every time you transmit. Most public safety agencies in the region are now on trunked systems, because you can have, say, 12 repeaters, but you can overload them with more sets of communication going on, because it's not dependent on just one repeater. You'll switch from repeater to repeater to repeater all the time. And if you try to monitor Lee County Public Safety, if you don't have a scanner that does trunking, that follows that, you'll get part of the conversation, part of the conversation, you won't be able to monitor it. To my knowledge, no one has implemented this yet in the amateur radio world, but it's not illegal. Trunking is legal in the amateur radio world, as long as you follow all the guidelines that the FCC has said. So Tier 3, I think sometime will come. I don't think in small areas like ours that we'll see it. Maybe places like New York City or Los Angeles where they have a ton of users, you might see it because of the loading on the repeaters. Our repeaters are not that busy that we need to trunk it. And I don't think we have enough going on that we would need to do that. But Tier 3 is coming at some point. And all of our radios that do tier 2 won't do tier 3. We'll have to get new radios again. Tier 3 also adds some features that for public safety would be a big deal. It adds a much larger data path. You can send much more data at the same time as voice because of it being trunked. And typically in a trunked system, there will be a voice channel and a data channel that cooperate with each other. But we haven't seen that yet in the amateur radio world. So DMR for amateur use. I was talking about Motorola Amateur Radio Club just a little bit ago. They're the ones that really started the process of getting DMR out of the commercial world and into the amateur world. Now, those of you that may not know Motorola, they're really proud of their stuff. And they're very proprietary on their stuff. So the open source DMR protocol had some things laid on top of it by Motorola, and it became Moto Turbo. And only Motorola equipment could talk to Motorola equipment. It's an open source protocol that then had stuff put on top of it, so it's no longer open source. Now, what we use is open source, because other people have gone along and done additional work afterwards. But Motorola began the process, and as I said earlier, they put a repeater in every one of their shops. And they had all these gazillion-dollar radios for public safety that they converted for use on DMR for amateur radio. And that got to be quite popular. They'd show up to the club meetings and talk on their radios, and guys wouldn't want to buy it, and so DMR started picking up, even at the ridiculous price that Motorola charges for their radios. I used to buy Motorola radios for the sheriff's office, and most radios that are on the deputies' belts are in the neighborhood of $4,000 to $5,000 per radio. And I've proven that a deputy can break a railroad tie with a rubber mallet. We were giving them very expensive radios, but they weren't able to take care of them, except they were Motorola's. And you could beat somebody over the head with it. Seen it? Might have even participated. Have you ever wondered why on Motorola radios there's a knob on the tip of the antenna? You ever wondered why that's there? That's because when a deputy swings the radio from the antenna, it doesn't slip out of his hand. So Motorola took all these really expensive radios and started putting them into the ham radio world. And they started to link the repeaters. And that got to be really popular, because you could be in, say, Washington at a Motorola plant and then talk to somebody in Northern California at a Motorola plant. You couldn't do that before the digital world came into being. You couldn't do that on a handheld. You had to go back to your HF to talk to somebody very far away. And so all of a sudden, we have guys talking across state lines on their handhelds because of linked repeaters. Motorola introduced a couple more things called IP Site Connect, and then ultimately the DMR and DMR network. And we have this thing rolling out across the country now at Motorola shops with Motorola repeaters and Motorola handhelds, and people are talking to each other all over the world. IP Site Connect was a way of taking the ones and zeros coming in on the network or on the RF side and continuing its path across an IP network, such as the internet. Now, it didn't ride the internet at first. It rode Motorola's proprietary networks that were riding from location to location. The internet wasn't strong enough yet to carry that, so Motorola had their own network. But then they branched it out to go on the internet as well, and they could actually have repeaters at places that weren't Motorola shops. And it just continued to grow and continued to grow. Here's basically, I'm sorry for the graphics, that was the best one I could find. is basically how it works. You've got a site up, a site one, handhelds and mobiles, they go into the repeater. But then the repeater sends the data into a standard IP network. We call it the cloud. And then that cloud then sends it back out to all the other sites. And in the commercial world, or in public safety, you have consoles and so forth that then transmit into the system. So you get on the, say site one is the KF5IW repeater, you get on that repeater and you talk on a talk group that is programmed to go out the gateway into the cloud, and somebody else picks up that same talk group in a different location. That's essentially the magic of DMR communication. It is taking the ones and zeros that your radio has created and is sending them from the RF world through the IP world to another place where it goes out the RF world. It's really quite simple. It's not that difficult at all. As the network grew, they discovered we're going to have to segment this off because it's too big. DMR is a central hub with spokes on it. Not all digital modes are that way, but DMR is a hub with spokes. Well, then they had to get a little bit more creative, and so you've got the DMR marked Central USA bridge, and then they've got a whole bunch of other bridges connected to it. The bridge, the standard IP network there, think of that as a bridge. And every one of those orange boxes is another kind of bridge. So you've got bridges talking to bridges, so you have multiple repeaters talking to a bridge, talking to another bridge that goes to multiple repeaters. The network is just built out that far. But all under the control of DMR Mark. Sir? Exactly. Years ago in the commercial world, we had telephone bridges where everybody could dial in and you could have a big conference call. That's essentially what it is. Matter of fact, Motorola stole that technology, stole kind of a hard word, adopted that technology from a telephone conference bridge and made it the central bridge of their DMR Mark network. So now we have multiple central bridges and we have multiple other bridges. KF5IW doesn't talk to the central bridge, it talks to the K4USD, get that right, K4USD bridge, Chicagoland bridge, and multiple others. And so we have bridge talking to bridge talking to bridge, and the network continues to build out. Okay, so what's a talk group? Essentially, a talk group is a digital ID. Remember, we're talking ones and zeros. Go back to the commercial world. The vendor wants Al's taxi to have radios. So there's a dispatcher on a frequency talking to Al's radios. But Al's taxi. Al's taxi doesn't want to hear Joe the plumber. So they had to set up on the same frequency, a different group. And since it's digital, you have a digital ID for a group of radios. We call that a talk group. In the commercial world, you have one for Al's taxi, one for Joe the plumber, etc. In the amateur radio world, these are just a few of the representative ones we have. Worldwide calling has a talk group ID, digital ID of 1. And everybody's radio that has that programmed in it, when somebody keys up their radio and that goes out to the central bridge and then goes out to all the other repeaters, if they're listening for digital ID 1, it'll come up. So you talk in Fort Myers and somebody in Nome, Alaska hears worldwide calling and is able to respond, or any number of other talk groups. Those are just representative, those are not all of them. There are thousands of them. Zones, what's a zone? Well, Well, we know what the word means, but what did Motorola mean? Because all of this is because of Motorola. Because they were the first ones doing it. Well, to Motorola it means this is a group of people I want to stay together. In our example before, Al's Taxi. They would have a zone. You know, Al's Taxi grew and they got busy and they needed 3 or 4 talk groups. They needed a talk group to talk to their taxis in the north part of the city, in the central city, in the south. So they had multiple talk groups. And so Motorola called it a zone where you had Al's Taxi talk groups in. In our world, the zone is just a grouping of channels. Typically, when we write a code plug, we're putting all the channels, say for the KF5IW repeater, in one zone. The number 16 is arbitrary on Motorola's part. I traveled years ago. I traveled over to Sunrise, big Motorola testing plant, manufacturing plant, where they work on a lot of the public safety handhelds. And I asked one of the engineers, we were talking to some engineers about designs of radios. I asked them, why do you have 16 channels on these radios? Because that was the most that we could get on the knob and still be able to see the line. You want to find an arbitrary way to figure out how many channels to put in there? How big kind of line do you got? That's how they figured it out. There's nothing magical about 16. But 18, the line was too small, you couldn't see it. But DMR in the amateur radio world just follows the convention. There are a few radios that have gone away from that. The MDUV380 has 32 channels. Well, they report 32 channels. I think it's actually infinite. No, more than 16. Yeah, like 32 A and B. And they're talking about that actually it's infinite, they just didn't have more slots. So it's confusing. But most DMR radios are 16 in the zone, just because that's what the protocol was. It's just a grouping of channels. Early commercial radios, as I said, were limited to the 16, and so that just stuck. In the ham world, zones are typically used to group channels by location or by repeater. In the FMARC code plugs, we typically have KF5IW 2 zones for that, because there's more than 16 channels. And the W4 LCO, we have multiple zones as well, because we have different kinds of channels. It's just a way to group channels together. In the zone, you could do it if you wanted to, all of your worldwide channels. You could make another zone for all of your TAC channels for different repeaters. It's just however you want to lay it out. That would, I think, be kind of confusing. Keeping your repeater information together makes more sense to me, but I don't know. Now, what's color code? You hear talk about color code. When DMR was first getting introduced into the area, I was listening to a couple of conversations, and somebody said, my radio's black. You understand the confusion? Color code doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. It's a stupid thing to call it. For those of us that are a little bit technical, and you're an amateur radio operator, so you're a little bit technical. You know what a PL tone is. You know what a CSS tone is. But Al, the taxi driver, doesn't. And so Motorola came up with this idea, let's call them color codes. So Al, the taxi, is going to be color code green. Al didn't know that meant that he was going to be on a particular tone, digital tone. That's all it is. Color code is a specific tone, a particular tone for a repeater. Most of our repeaters in this area are on color code 1. It doesn't have anything to do with color. It just kind of kind of for Al, the taxi driver, who doesn't know. It allows adjacent systems to not interfere. If you have multiple systems in the area, you need the reason we have CTCS S-tones on our repeaters is to keep adjacent systems from interfering. Same thing with color code. Ooh. Man, I went too fast. What time is it? 10:32. Let me do a little describing here. How we program DMR radios. We'll go over this more later, but there's digital ID and then there's RX groups. This is where some people get confused, particularly if they have a GD77. When you're programming your radio, I like to, hey Tom, don't forget to sign in. When I'm beginning a code plug, if I'm starting from scratch, I start with the digital IDs. Because you have to build your system. So I start with the digital IDs and I begin to program them in. You know, worldwide calling, 1, local 2, North America, 3, programming those all in there. It's a digital form of identification for each of the top groups. Digital ID also works for you. When you got registered for a DMR number, that 7-digit number they gave you is your digital ID. That tells the world who you are. There has to be a database where it looks it up. Because it wasn't designed for the amateur radio world, it has the ID instead of the call sign. Motorola Mark actually looked at replacing digital ID with call sign. And in the protocol, that introduced way more problems than they were going to solve. So I always begin my code plug with digital ID. I program those in first. And in the GD77, I at the same time program in an RX group. The GD77 and a couple other radios require a transmit digital ID and a receive digital ID. Actually, all the radios do, but most of the radios do that magically in the background, whereas the GD77 you have to program. So I program a local 2 talk group with a digital ID of 2. I then immediately go in and program an RX group, local 2, with a 2 as an ID. And then I go in and I program some channels. And in your programming software, you have to program in what the frequency is of the repeater for transmit, what the frequency is for receive, and you have to program in a bunch of other things that you normally would. What do you call that channel? And you then have to associate a digital ID with the channel. So we're going to build a local 2 talk group, and we're going to program in the channel frequency for transmit, the channel frequency for receive. We're going to associate it to local 2, which we built in the first step, the RX group, and then we're going to save that. We've got it named local 2. It knows to go out on that particular frequency. It knows to listen on that particular frequency. And because we called it local 2, we've associated local 2 with it. We've got all that built as a channel. Then, after we built the channels, we then have to go in and build zones. Put those channels together. So it gets kind of complex. Guys will always want to start with channel. Because that's what we're used to. You program a radio, you go in and you program your frequency, your offset, and your PL tone, and you're done. Well, in DMR you can't do that because there's all sorts of other things that you have to put in there. And so you get your zones done, then you go into general settings and you set some things. What's the one thing that everybody forgets to program in general settings? The digital ID. Absolutely. They're keying up their radio and the digital ID they send is 1. They forget that we can't tell who they are because they didn't program in their ID. So in general settings you program in um, your ID and a few other things. And under button definition, you program in a few things. And when we set up my laptop, so I'll actually show you these screens, I'll show you some buttons to unselect. DMR is a commercial protocol. It's not an amateur protocol. And so there's a bunch of stuff built in it that you don't want. You don't want somebody the ability to come and turn your radio off remotely. That's an option. I can do it to your radio. If you haven't turned your DMR, if you haven't unmarked that space in your programming, I can go in and I can turn your radio off. And then you'll look at it and you'll go, oh, it doesn't work anymore, send it back, it's broken. But then I can turn it back on again, so when you send it to the repair place, you look stupid. There's also a way that, because it's a commercial protocol, I can activate your microphone and you won't know it. Cool. Be surprised what you can hear. No, but you could. And so I want to show you those things to turn off. Because you don't need somebody turning off your radio. And you don't need somebody listening to whatever may be going on when you're not present. Push the top. So we'll look at that as well. Then you program the radios, you build your scan groups, and let me explain to you RX groups different than from the GD77. We have scan lists where you can scan local 2, local 9, WW1, and so forth. RX group is where you can monitor multiple talk groups at the same time. It's really cool until you get confused. You hear something and you want to respond, well, what talk group was it on? There are some times when there's an advantage, but most of the time it's not. But you can listen. I have mine on local 2, on KF5IW, on local 2, I have mine set up so I also listen to local 9. Don't get confused very often because nobody ever transmits on local 9. But should they transmit on local 9, I'll hear it. But when I go to transmit, I'm transmitting back on local 2. So I have to remember that if somebody does. RX groups are kind of like a scan group, but they're not. They're a little bit more complex. I generally tell people don't worry about them, except in the GD77, and then I use them as a one-to-one relationship. I'm not going to talk about DMR Plus now. We have to go back later and talk about that. Any questions? We've got some time now in this first hour for some questions. I'm sure that I've said some things you need clarified. Yes, sir.
On your first slides, you also had fusion. I don't know anything about fusion. I just wondered if you could do a quick definition of it, and how that anything relates to it.
What I will do is I'll go back to that slide, but what I'll do is say, be here at 1, and all your fusion questions will be answered. How's that? Is that good, Steve?
It's a hell of a challenge, sir.
Yeah, I put this slide up because I wanted you to see the comparison kind of the different, these are the primary digital nodes. And Fusion and DMR are very similar in actual digital protocol. They are variants of the same thing, but they're not the same. Okay? D-Star is the outlier. D-Star is completely different than DMR and Fusion, P25, NXDN, and so forth. D-Star is completely different. D-Star is designed for amateur radio use by amateur radio operators, and so everything is focused on amateur radio, whereas in all these others, it's not. And it had to be built in. But I wanted you to see how, what happened? I wanted you to see it, but now you're not going to.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it is. This screen went dark as well.
Oh, that's even more exciting.
Remember I said deputies could break a railroad track with a rubber mallet? I was a deputy for a long time, so
You got a flashlight now?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, isn't that cool?
Still power here.
Is Fusion the Yaesu version of these actually?
No. Fusion is Yaesu version, there it is. What? Did you just time out?
I think you just talked about
Neat. So pressing the button there doesn't do that, okay. Fusion is Yaesu's entrance into the digital war. And they took a protocol already existing, C4FK or C4FM, and DMR is a variant of that, Fusion is a variant of that, P25 is a variant of that. Fusion is the only one that is proprietary. D-Star is open source, DMR is open source, but when Yaesu built their system, they made it proprietary. Now, others have come along and reverse engineered it since, and so you'll have a different network, a couple of different networks for Fusion, and Steve will be teaching later this afternoon on WiresX, the Yaesu version of networking. There are a couple of others that you can get into that you don't need Fusion equipment for, but it is essentially the same way. It works the same way. It takes the audio, converts it through the codec, sends ones and zeros. The scheme of creating the ones and zeros and the data sent along with the voice is different in Fusion than it is from DMR. But the networking and interconnectivity is very similar. They are the same thing but different. Yes, ma'am.
Does the conversion take place in the radio or at the other
Yes, both. When you talk into your radio, there's an AMB chip, and all digital voice modes use the same chip, except D-Star uses an older version of it and uses the 6.25 kilohertz channel path, as well as the rest use 12.5, 6.25, and the rest use 12.5. The AMB chip in the radio takes the audio and converts it, and then that's sent across the airwaves. You'll hear just tones. When you try to listen to a digital station, you're just hearing basically noise. It makes no sense. On the other end, it then takes that digital noise and converts it back to audio, puts the ones and zeros in the right place. The AMB chip then converts it the other way and puts it out of your speaker. So it happens both, transmit and receive on both sides.
But it's happening in the radio.
In the radio. Unless, muddy the waters a little bit, unless you're using some of the protocols that actually do it just on the radio side. There is a version of on the repeater side. There's a version of DMR that uses an analog radio, and it's only DMR from repeater to repeater. It's not approved for amateur radio use, but it is approved in the commercial world. And it wasn't very popular because the conversion didn't happen properly all the time. But the AMB chip actually resided on the repeater, not on the radio. It would be a lot. They did that because it was cheaper to build the radio without the AMB chip and only have one for 500 radios instead of one chip in every radio. But it didn't work very well. Yes, sir.
On talk groups, and this is one of the ones that keeps following up, they seem to be divided by certain functions. There seem to be talk groups that are geographical in nature, like Florida, worldwide. And then there's that are functional in nature, like the TAC groups, which are there's really no difference functionality between them.
No, they're exactly the same.
And then the locals, does a local 2, local 9 only ever appear on the system? Say the local repeater?
Theoretically, local 2 is only supposed to appear on your local machine.
Okay.
We have converted that system so that our local 2 appears in Punta Gorda and Naples.
But it's on our closed system.
It's technically it's supposed to be. What we should have done, so that we could talk all around Southwest Florida, is we should have created a Southwest Florida talk group and left local 2 local to the machine. The way it's initially supposed to work, talk group 2 and talk group 9 are local. And so when the repeater sees those talk groups, it knows I only have to rebroadcast it, I don't need to send it out the digital gateway. We have then altered that in our use here, because everybody was on local 2 and we wanted to talk to Charlotte County and we wanted to talk to Naples, that we bridged our local 2 into Naples and into Collier County. There's no law against that, there's no rule against it, it's just not standard operating procedure. We should have done it.
Happens in our environment.
Yeah. And
Other than that, local 2 and local 9 are really just resident.
yes.
And,
Okay, you think about that. Bentley had his hand up.
So now, do you have to reprogram the DMR if you move it automatically, for instance, say with the Q or carry, for instance, or
The answer to that question is maybe. Depends on what you have programmed in your radio. You have to have, when we're building the channel, remember we have to have the repeater frequency. Well, that's going to be dependent on the repeater you want to talk on. We have 2 DMR repeaters now in Lee County. They're on different frequencies. So I have to build a channel for the KF5IW, and I have to build, in all the talk groups, a channel for each one of those, and then I have to build channels for W4LCO in all the talk groups. So the answer to the question is, yeah, you have to build a new set of channels for every repeater you want to talk on. I was trying to help Dale out, where there he is, putting some Orlando talk groups in. We built a code plug before and I couldn't find it. Where's Tim? I couldn't find it again, the one that has the Orlando ones on it. I got the same problem you had with the wrong model.
Okay.
So if you could email me that, those 2, again, that would help me out. I may be able to solve Dale's problem. But anyway, how to get there? See, that's the problem with being a preacher. You can go for a long time and forget where you were. Who asked me that question? What did you ask? I'm sorry.
If you can take his
I'm going to
radio,
blame it on good drugs.
if you can take his radio other places without reprogramming the,
Yeah, so you have to program your radio for each repeater that you want to use. Yeah, you might be, perchance, fortunate and find another repeater that you're going to use that's already on the same frequency, but not likely. Yes, ma'am?
2 questions. Can you use Chirp to do programming, and where do you look up website?
There are multiple places you can look them up. DMRmark.net has a nice long list. If you're looking at DMR Mark talk groups, the W4LCO repeater is on Grandmeister, which we're going to talk about in the next time. And you look that up on grandmeister.net. And can you use Chirp? Not yet. They're working really hard on doing DMR stuff in Chirp, but I'm not sure why they haven't been able to really get it going. You might be able to, some of the radios you can read, but it's difficult to program because it's not just frequency, CTCSS, title, and so forth. You got to put a lot of other stuff in there. And the way I understand it, Chirp has to completely rewrite their whole system in order to accommodate more than just channel name, frequency offset, PL tone, and so forth. So Chirp doesn't yet do it. They're working on it. I read about people talking all the time about, yeah, I think we got it. No, we don't got it. Yes, sir.
2 questions kind of interlocked. The first part is local to here, local to Naples. Those are actually 2 different frequencies, so they don't step on each other, correct?
Yeah, in Naples, you might be on the local 2 talk group, but it's on the Naples frequency.
Correct. So when you
And it's just bridged through the bridge
yeah.
to Fort Myers KF5IW local 2, which
Right.
is on a different frequency.
So you hit corkscrew, and it's not going to continue. You got to switch over, or else you
Right.
don't get it. The second part is, what do you use for your IP? Is it just simple Comcast Business? And if that goes down, do you have a direct link? How is it connected?
The internet from here, because the KF5IW repeater is here,
Right.
and it rides Lee County's internet. And I don't
Lee County-
remember who they said provided, I think maybe Comcast
Right,
provides their hub here to this, and then whatever
Whatever
to
theirs
the other
is.
end repeater, what theirs is.
so it goes website to website in theory, and then it connects up. Now, if that goes down, is there a direct link? Is
No,
there
there's not a direct link. You could do a direct link, you could do point to point.
a microwave
DMR.
system or something?
You could do that. IP link will work across microwave.
I'm asking because, it's not uncommon to lose cable and internet during a hurricane, so then, boom, that connection's
Right.
gone.
That's why we don't rely, in the Aries world, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't rely on
Outside infrastructure.
things that require the internet.
It's, unit to unit, or,
Yeah.
or tower powered by tower.
Right.
Okay.
Handheld to handheld DMR works very well.
Mhm.
Either simplex or half duplex, works very well. You're not going to get any of the fading or anything that you get when you're on the fringes of FM. You're either going to work or you're not. Because if it can't get all the ones and zeros to put back together your signal, you're not going to get any of it. So in that regard, we do recommend that if you're stationed out in Lehigh at a shelter, and this is a lesson Dave learned the hard way, if you're at a shelter, bring your DMR radio, because you might be able to get in with that. First of all, the repeater has a very high footprint, and you might be able to get in when the others aren't, but it actually works just a little bit better than FM does. Sir?
Rich, tell me a little bit more about attack groups, what they are, how to access them, and so on. I understand, etiquette dictates that we should only use certain. You don't want to talk across town on one, for example, or what I call it. But tell me more about the attack groups.
There are a series of TAC channels called TAC 310 through 319, it was 18 or 19. TAC 310, 11, 12, maybe 13 are also bridged to Brandmeister. A TAC channel is, again, that's a throwback to the commercial world. You have a dispatch channel and then you have a TAC channel where you can chit chat. And that's what TAC 310 is, or 311 or 312, whatever. You switch, you make your contact, it's a calling channel, worldwide calling. You make your contact, and then you tell people, let's jump over to TAC 310. And 310 then is a place where you can go and just have a long-term conversation. 310, 311, 312, maybe 313 are also bridged to Brandmeister. So you have somebody on a Brandmeister repeater wants to talk to somebody on a DMR Mark repeater, they can do that because there is a place where TAC 310 Brandmeister is bridged to TAC 310 DMR Mark. And it's just a channel for casual communication. There are a number of talk groups like that. Yes, sir.
Okay, I understand when you go like worldwide, you're hooking up on a lot of repeaters.
Yep.
When you're on a tech channel, say I'm talking to somebody in St. Louis, Missouri, on tech 310. How many repeaters are involved?
It's hard to say. Most of the TAC channels are what they call push to talk only. In other words, the network sends out a signal, okay, I've got communication on TAC 310. And most repeaters are going to ignore that unless somebody on the RF side of the repeater has keyed up on TAC 310. That tells the repeater, hey, I want to listen to that. And for the next 15 minutes, TAC 310 transmission coming across the network will also go out to the RF. If no push to talk occurs, if no RF traffic occurs on that repeater in 15 minutes, it shuts down. So that's what we call push to talk channels, dynamic talk groups. Each repeater will have a certain number of static talk groups, that if information comes across the network on that talk group, it'll go out the RF side. They're limited. We typically limit how many static talk groups we have. But it's really unlimited how many how many dynamic talk groups you can have. So you go to the KF5IW and switch over to TAC 310 and just kerchunk it. Now the repeater knows I want to listen to 310, and all the traffic on 310 will come out the radio. If you don't kerchunk it or talk on it again, it will shut down in 15 minutes. John?
So is all TAC 310 the same, or is it more of a virtual talk group? For instance, if Dave's in Poughkeepsie and we catch each other on USA and say go to TAC 310, and so he kerchunks on his repeater and I kerchunk on my repeater and we're talking, and then somebody on another talk group says, hey, meet me on TAC 310.
They'll be right in the middle of your conversation.
Okay.
There's only one 310.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir?
Okay, if somebody puts up a repeater in New Jersey, puts up a bridge in Jersey, do we have to reprogram the radios?
No. They program theirs to say have worldwide, they could program Florida talk group into their Jersey repeater. And then you're on Florida down here, they're on Florida up there, and you're talking. You don't have to program anything different on our end. They have to program to get their bridge into the network. There?
Getting back to TAC, if, for example, two people switch over to TAC 310, and then the only two people on TAC 310, my understanding is only those two repeaters will be activated.
Right. But because we're ham radio operators, we're nosy, and we hear somebody switch to 310, we all go to 310.
Okay, but we're not activating an entire network.
Right. Admit it, you guys do that too. I'm not the only one. Yes, sir?
Steve, I got a real basic question. A program that when a UV3 creates, program code groups are based on your other code groups. You turn it on, I can see there's activity on it, but it comes out no audio.
Because it's not a talk group that you're currently listening to.
I see.
So that's one of the things that is a mystery to us, because we're used to, if there's activity on a frequency, we can hear it. Well, now there's multiple talk groups potential on there. The digital ID, you have to tell your radio, I want to listen to digital ID 310. So that when digital traffic comes for ID 310, your radio then picks it up. Now, there is on the new UV 380 and on the old 380s with the experimental firmware, ladies, don't hurt me for this, but there is what's called promiscuous mode. I was telling somebody that on the radio the other day, and my wife came in to study just as I was saying that. The explanation took a long time. What I was talking about, promiscuous mode. That means that you can listen to every talk group that comes across that radio, or that frequency. It's not going to only open up for the one you have selected, it will open up for all of them. I think that's built in to the factory firmware of the UV380. Tim?
When I was doing some research on a promiscuous mode, it appeared that the promiscuous mode would only open the channels on the time slot that you were tuned into.
That is correct. The initial application in the earliest forms of the MD380 experimental firmware was promiscuous mode for the time slot you had selected. Later versions, they have been working to make it so that it's both time slots. It's essentially time slot agnostic.
Does that work now?
Yes and no. I say that because I've seen it happen where I know I'm on time slot 2, but I'm getting time slot 1 traffic, but it doesn't happen all the time. So I think there's part of that code they still don't have addressed in that. But my understanding is on the UV380, that has been adopted and is working on both time slots. Now, I only had one in my hand for a little while and I didn't like it and I gave it back real quick. The buttons on that thing are just not intuitive, and the system doesn't work intuitively.
Yeah, that's what I'm finding out.
It's cuckoo. I don't know why they did it. Well, I do know why they did it. They took all of the MD 2017s that they couldn't sell, they repackaged them as the MD UV380. and they're trying to sell it. It has all the same problems of the 2017, except that crazy little trackball. Yes, sir?
Real quick, this is a question too, real quick. I can't reliably get my computer sitting in my house. So I have time with open spot. Just so I understand, the open spot, all that does is basically it bypasses the repeater and puts me right on the internet.
That's correct.
Going to, I talked to St. Louis, going to the St. Louis top group, it then goes on there.
That's correct. The open spot essentially is a repeater without repeat function. It is your gateway to the internet, but you can't talk to DMR Mark network with it.
So if somebody's on DMR Mark now,
If somebody is on a DMR Mark only network, you're not going to get to them from the open spot, the jumbo spot, the zoom spot, or any other spot. You've got to be Motorola or Hytera equipment only, repeater equipment only, to be on a DMR Mark network. Remember what I said at the beginning? DMR Mark, or Mark, Motorola Amateur Radio Club, are pretty protective of their stuff. On their network, nothing happens without them. You gotta have, they finally let Hytera on the network. But Hytera paid them big bucks to do that. You can't get a hotspot on the DMR Mark network. So you're talking to DMR Plus, or you're talking to Brandmeister, or you're talking to a hybrid of them, or sometimes there are some places like TAC 310 and so forth where you can get on through Brandmeister into DMR Mark.
but that answers questions as to why certain ones I cannot.
That's correct.
That answers my question.
And that's my frustration with DMR Mark. We're all amateur radio operators. Let's all play together. Let's not exclude half of the world because you want to protect your gazillion-dollar radio.
The scope, how big is DMR Mark compared to the rest?
It was the largest, but because they refuse to play in the hotspot world, and hotspots are really taking off. I talked to the manager of HRO in Delaware a few weeks ago when I was up there buying a new radio. Oh, my wife bought it for me, so that's okay. He said that they have sold 18,000 Zoom spots. 18,000! Zoom Spot can't make them fast enough for HRO to sell them. Because it's just so much easier. You control it. You know, I've got the repeater 3 miles from my house, but I've got a Zoom Spot running in my house on DMR and DStar. It's easy. It works beautiful, and it's cheap. Yes, sir.
And that is the same as when you use those little Raspberry hotspots, yes or no?
Yeah, the Zoom Spot is a Raspberry Pi hat.
And all it does is it takes my signal and puts it back into this repeater, but pulls in locally in the house.
The typical Zoom Spot has a 10 milliwatt radio on it.
Yeah.
And you talk to it on your handheld or your mobile, and it takes your traffic just like the repeater would, and sends it out the internet
Into the cloud.
into the cloud, into whatever network you're going to.
And so I can literally just, like I said, pick the Disney Channel there. Just it'll go from my house into one of. It'll just go to their repeater. I have a little repeater in my house.
It's like a little repeater in your house, but with DMR you can't link to a repeater. That's one of the advantages of DStar. I confess, I am a DStar fan.
What do you mean it won't link? In that, like,
You cannot link repeater to repeater with DMR. You link repeater to talk group or to groupings of repeaters, but not individual repeaters. NX2G used to be a member of our club down here. He moved back to New York. He's in White Plains, New York. He gets on his repeater in Valhalla, New York. And I link the W4 LCO repeater to the Valhalla repeater. I'm not going through any other reflector. I'm just going from our repeater to his repeater, linked directly. DStar has that built in. DMR does not. You have to go to a cloud type structure. You can't go individual repeater to repeater. Admittedly, I like DStar way more than DMR. Now, let me tell you the difference. This radio cost me $100. It's a TYT MD3, $100, right? It does DMR and FM, UHF FM pretty good. My D-Star radio, this is the greatest radio known to man for handheld use. It's the ICOM ID 51A Plus 2. This is $359. So it's a lot more expensive than the DMR radio. But this is VHF, UHF, has GPS built in. I can do nearest repeater. I can tell it. When I was traveling just recently, I just said, hey, what's the nearest repeater? And I always had a repeater I could talk to. I don't need to do a lot of messing around with it. I can tell this radio, hey, I want to link directly to the Valhalla repeater. I can link directly to the Valhalla repeater. I don't need reflectors and so forth. So you pay for it, but it's the nicest one going, I think. And I admit it. I am a big D-Star fan. I use DMR because that's what we have around here, and I understood it because of my work at the sheriff's office, and so I got involved in it. I would much rather use D-Star. And over here, I haven't heard from Tom yet.
The D-Star, you don't have to change code plugs and mess around with a lot of programming where you're going to
No, because I did it for you.
accidentally miss something and then not get anything at all.
You don't have to do that, Tom, because I did it for you.
I'm playing with it now. I'm getting that. And
That's why I haven't heard you. You're playing with it. I got it.
But the other thing too is that I wanted to ask a question going back. When you have end user settings, you have channel, zone, general settings, and then button something.
Right.
Button
Definitions.
definitions. Thank you.
Michael, you got a question?
Yeah, I was trying to explain to myself that you had an outside, like, vehicle antenna that says that really small one,
Yep.
you can't fire the, it's not the power that is needed for the spot or
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, I wouldn't connect my Zoom spot to an outside antenna because you're going to overload the receiver front end. But you don't need a lot of range with that. But it's okay to take your handheld and connect it to an outside antenna. That works great. Get you one of the little SMA adapters and connect it to an outside antenna. You can talk to the repeater down in Naples. You can talk to the repeater up in Port Charlotte, whatever. I have to warn you, I'm being told from the back we have to go to break.
Oh.
But I'll take 2 more questions, otherwise Steve's going to hurt me. Larry?
Outside antennas and SMA adapters. SMAs are notoriously fragile.
Yeah.
And I know tower radio now selling.
Contact name is what you call it. We would say call it local 2. It's a group call, and by that the radio knows this is going to multiple people. If I put it as private, it would go to just one ID. Okay, and you use that becomes important in some DMR plus stuff, and then the ID number. And so you fill this out with every one of the talk groups you want. 310, 311, 312, Florida, Southwest Florida, Space Coast. I mean, there's a gazillion, and that's probably not an exaggeration, of digital contacts that you can put in there. But you also then want to put in users in your community that you talk to a lot, put their name in there, make it a private call, and then put their 7-digit ID. Remember, DMR is a commercial standard. It doesn't transmit to call sign. But we want to see somebody's call sign. I don't want to know that I'm talking to 311-2792. I want to know that I'm talking to WG4K. And so I have to put in his number and his name or his call sign, and then the radio will compute that for me and display that. If you have an MD380 and you're using some of the experimental software, you don't have to worry about putting people's 7-digit ID and their call sign in the digital ID, because there is in the experimental software or experimental firmware, there is a method where you can download the entire 100,000 IDs into a little database in spare memory, and the firmware will go out when it sees a 7-digit ID, will go out and look into that database and then flash that call sign on the screen for you. So if you've got an MD380 and you're using experimental firmware, you don't have to worry about putting call signs in the digital contacts. So you load all of your talk groups into digital contacts. Then you go down to channels. A lot of information here, but most of it you don't mess with. So you begin at the top, it's going to be, the channel node is going to be digital, whatever the channel name is. The convention I like to use is repeater talk group number. So that I know I'm talking on the KF5IW and I'm talking on local 2. That's how I label my, my channels so that I can keep track of them. And then RX frequency, TX frequency. Remember, it's a commercial protocol. They don't do offset. We have standard offset. 0.6 for VHF, 5 meg for UHF. In the commercial world, they don't do that. They may have an offset that's 7.5 megs. And so you have to program in the transmit and the receive frequency. You'd be surprised how many amateur radio operators this confuses. But what's the offset? Well, it doesn't matter. You have to program in each frequency. So program in the frequency, admit criteria. I'm going to say this, and I'll deny that I said it later, but if a repeater owner asks me, I always make admit criteria being always. Repeater owners don't want you to do that because that means you can step on someone. So in community code plugs, I changed the admit criteria to channel free. Instead of color code free, channel free means that the talk group is no longer talking. So you can't talk on somebody. I run the net on Thursday night, and if I had channel free, I'd have to wait until the channel dropped every time to talk. And I don't want to wait that long. And because I did the programming, I make it as always. Technically, you should make it channel free. That's the courteous way to do it. I'm not very courteous. And if you have a GD77, you can only make it always. There's still a bug in their firmware, so you have to make it always on the GD77. That's my excuse in it. And then down on the right side, you'll see contact name. Over here, contact name. That's where you put in your talk group ID that you created in the digital IDs. The first one we created was contact 1. So you put that in that field, and you would do that, you would create a channel for every talk group you want to talk about. So you start by making the digital ID, and then you go to a channel and you put in the transmit and receive frequency and the admit criteria and so forth, and then you fill that blank in with the talk group ID that you created in the first stage. And you do that for every channel you want to talk about. Takes a long time, doesn't it, Tom? It's confusing. Takes a long time. Then you set color code, and you set repeater slot, time slot. I wish they would call it time slot rather than repeater slot, but the Chinese, in their translation, will call it repeater slot. There's a standard for how that goes, and most things are on time slot 2, and a few things are on time slot 1. You would just have to look at the code plug. We don't have time to go through how all that fits. But you would look at what we standardized for the repeater and program it in that way. Local 2 is on time slot 2. Worldwide 1 is on time slot 1, and so forth. So you do that for every channel. Then after channel, then you go down to zone. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Your timeout, I see you got it at 60.
That's a standard. That's one of the things I changed, usually to 120.
120.
Yeah, 120. That's a busy channel timeout, so if you throw your radio in your car on the seat, you sit down and you're sitting on it, you'll only be able to do that for whatever you set in that field. By default is 60 seconds. I like to set it, because I like to talk, I like to set it about 120 or 160. Or you'll get the blue crystal. I've not ever yet received one of those, so, because I set mine originally. So in zone, then you take all the channels that you've built and you apply them to a zone. This is not complicated. It's just hard because you haven't done it. Once you program one radio and you play with it for a while, you'll be an old hat at it. It's not that complicated. Guys tell me all the time, I can't figure it out, I can't figure it out. Digital ID, build your channel, build your zones, program your radio. It's that simple. If I can do it, you can do it. It's that simple. Now, I was telling you about under button definitions. Hold on. Menu item. There, menu item. There's a bunch of things on there that you want to turn off. Okay? Remote monitor, remote enable, and remote disable. Turn those off. Do I have a question over here? Turn those off, or we can mess with your radio remotely. Turn it off.
Back up a little bit, turn one off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Remote monitor, remote enable, and remote disable. I've tested this between my GD77 and my MD380. I can turn off my MD380 from my GD77. I cannot turn off my GD77 from my MD380. I can though from another GD77. So somebody during the net, I may just play with somebody to see if they listen to the instructions. And go in and set their ID up in my radio to transmit a code to remote disable your radio. Then you'll go to talk and it won't work. No matter what you do, it won't work until I turn it back on. You don't want that. That's a throwback to the old commercial world. And we beg them to take this out, but they continue to leave it in. Yes, sir.
In case that event happens that's not you, you just have to basically open up the programming and turn it off that way, and it'll go back to normal?
On the 380, yes. On the GD77, it has to be the radio that turned it off.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, you can really get screwed that way.
Yeah, you can really get hurt. Turn it off in the first place so that people don't mess with you. And then you take care of all those things. You go into general settings and you set over here the radio name. I typically put my call sign in, then put under radio ID, your 7-digit ID. Down on the bottom, under intro screen, you have 2 lines that you can have. I typically put my call sign so it appears on the front of the radio when I turn it on, and then I put the code plug version. So that, and I do that on the community code plug, so that when somebody says, hey, my code plug doesn't work, I can say, what version are you? Well, I don't know. Turn it on and look on the screen, it'll tell me what that says. That helps me to diagnose your problems. And that's what I put in the lower right, intro screen line 1, either call sign or date, and then intro screen line 2, I put version number, code plug version number. It's that easy to program your radios. You can do it yourself. You don't need me to do it. I'm happy to do it, but you don't need me to do it. All of you are capable of doing this. Just look at the logical steps. Digital ID, channel, zone, burn your radio. You can do it. Anybody think they can't do it? Good. I'm not going to get any calls this week. That's a generic MD380. Yeah. They're all of these, whether it's the 380 or the GD77, they are all variants of the Motorola software. And if you've ever worked with Motorola software, it's stupid. Motorola guys don't think like the rest of us. They think in different ways. They look at things differently, and so they've laid out their software differently. This is not ham-friendly, but you can learn it. It's not that complex. Yes, sir?
Who's the Motorola guy?
Who's the Motorola guy here now? Bob, you're a Motorola experience, don't you?
No, DMR.
No, but Motorola.
Yes.
With the, I mean, this looks a lot like Motorola programming software, right?
It does.
CPS?
Yes.
Yeah, it's almost identical to it. Who else here? Ray, in the wintertime, Ray has Motorola experience. AC9 JY or something?
Who's that guy close who checks in on me every once in a while?
I don't know.
He's a retired Motorola technician. He has all the stuff to say.
Yeah, the only reason I got involved in DMR is because I understood the programming software, because it's so similar to what we use in the public safety world. And I understood the nomenclature. We don't talk about talk groups in ham radio. We don't talk about zones in ham radio. And so I was the bridge between the way Motorola does it and the way the rest of the world does it. And so I ended up getting involved that way. Any questions on this programming? I wanted to go through it real quickly because I breezed through it beforehand, and I think some of your eyes glazed over when I was talking about it. This is easy. You know what you cannot do when you program these radios? You can't launch a missile. You can't hurt anybody. So play with it. Program your radio. The least that can happen is you make it so you can't transmit, and you have to get somebody to help you. But you're not going to hurt anybody, so play with it. Even download the experimental software and play with that and burn it to your radio, because you can't brick your radio. Play with it. That's what we do. We experiment. You don't need me to do all of this. You can do it yourself. You're just afraid. Stop being afraid. Put your big boy panties on and do it. It's easy. Have I said yet that it's easy? It's really easy. Any questions? I know. Guess what? I have a life too. Any other questions? Okay, let's go on to the W4LCO repeater. I have a few handouts. I did not anticipate this many people. This is a rework of, if you'll pass those out, I'd appreciate it. I didn't anticipate this many people, but this is a rework of what's on the FMARC website for use in the W4LCO repeater. Now, I said earlier that the KF5IW repeater is on DMR mark. Okay? It is restricted to Motorola and Hytera. The DMR mark network is restricted to Hytera. And you might have to share and pass them out to the guys on the other side, because they all went to this table only.
Yeah, I know.
Share. The W4LCO repeater is a dual mode, a multi-mode digital voice repeater. If we wanted to, we could turn on the W4LCO repeater for D-Star, DMR, P25, Gazer System Fusion, and NXDN. We could do all of those modes together. Now, it gets kind of resource hog when that happens, and so typically on an MMDVM repeater, we only have two different modes, and we've selected DMR and D-Star. And D-Star is getting a lot of use lately. I'm really happy to see that. I confess, I've said this before, I'm a huge D-Star fan. I tolerate DMR because it's a cheap radio and a lot of people have it. But if you want to play with a radio that works great and you can communicate with every D-Star network, regardless of who makes it, you want to be on D-Star, not DMR. So commercial order. So the W4LCO repeater is set up as D-Star and DMR. On D-Star, it can connect to all three, now 4, primary D-Star networking schemes. It defaults to XRF 757 Charlie, which is a reflector in what's called the quad net. It is a really neat reflector system that has some DMR reflectors or repeaters in it, has some D-Star repeaters in it. It even has some System Fusion repeaters in it. So you get on your D-Star radio and you're going out reflector XRF 757 Charlie, and you're talking to somebody maybe on DMR in some other location. It's really cool. On DMR, W4LCO is connected to the Brandmeister network, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a little bit. And it's also connected to the DMR Plus network, and we have the ability to link to XLX reflectors, much like we do in D-Star, the XRF reflectors.
Did you get one of these? I have one.
And I know that that's a lot of information, but the Brandmeister network is a little different than DMR Mark. DMR Mark is restricted to Motorola and Hytera radios or repeaters only. Brandmeister, they said, if you can get to it, we'll let you on it. So you have homebrew repeaters, you have hotspots, you have Motorola, you have ICOM, you have Kenwood, you have Bridgecom, you have all sorts of repeaters on Brandmeister. Mike?
Real quick, the iStar and there's a mode or whatever, you can go like DAC, DMR, and
Yes.
so forth, you just have to select it, but you can't talk to just DMR, you have to, that's what I was heard, when you select it, you can't talk to DMR, you just have to talk to DAC.
When Michael is talking about the software that runs our repeater, the software that runs a bunch of hotspots called PyStar, it has modes built in where you can go in on a Yaesu System Fusion radio and talk to DMR stuff, talk to a DMR network. It does some transcoding in the software. Remember, DMR and Yaesu System Fusion are cousins. They're from the same original protocol. D-Star is different. But you can do DMR to System Fusion to DMR, etc. The Brandmeister network grew rapidly and continues to outpace DMR Mark. A lot of clubs are leaving DMR Mark and going to Brandmeister because club members say, hey, I want to be able to use my hotspot and talk to the same talk groups. And you can't do that with DMR Mark. So Brandmeister is growing. 2 years ago, there was a big controversy around Brandmeister, and a lot of people began publishing less than factual data saying that Brandmeister was, you ready for it, part of the Russian collusion, and that the Brandmeister network gave the Russians backdoors into all of our networks. That has been thoroughly disproven, but for a while, it caused a lot of hardship for Brandmeister folks because they were afraid governments, local governments, wouldn't allow Brandmeister on their repeaters that touched their government internet because they're afraid of Russian collusion. I'm so tired of that word. So Brandmeister is a network similar to DMR Mark, except much bigger and allows a lot more things to connect to it. And so we decided we wanted to have another repeater in the area that gives us capability of talking on another network. Since we were restricted on KF5IW to DMR Mark, we built the W4LCO repeater that allows us to talk to Brandmeister. And on Brandmeister, you work it basically the same way. You program a talk group in your radio. The repeater knows, okay, you're gonna talk to Brandmeister Florida. It goes out and lights up all the repeaters that are listed on Brandmeister Florida. It's exactly the same way as you do it on the KF5IW. And in the handout, I've shown you just a few of the talk groups that are on the W4 LCO Brandmeister zone. Yes, sir.
The pack channels, are they the same on both repeaters? We got
TAC 310, 311, 312, maybe 313 are bridged somewhere in the system between Brandmeister and DMR Mark. So if you get on KF5IW 310 and you get on W4LCO 310, you can talk to each other. Okay, DMR Plus is where it gets a little bit more confusing. If you're coming to DMR world from the D-Star world, it's not confusing at all. If you're not familiar with D-Star, it's going to be kind of confusing. In DMR Plus, they use reflectors rather than talk groups. But they still need talk groups in order to talk to the reflectors. Yeah, it's confusing. So this is the way it works. On page, I guess I didn't put page numbers in. So I guess it's page 2. You will see under DMR Plus, I have listed some, what a zone looks like in the standard code block. You'll see talk group 8, and then reference reflector status, and then reflector disconnect. And then DMR Plus US Northwest link, DMR Plus Southeast link, Florida link, Georgia link, Great Lakes link, etc., etc. So the way it works is you take your DMR Plus radio, or your DMR radio, and you go to that zone, and you switch it to channel 2 in the zone, and you ka-chunk it. The radio then sends a signal, a digital, one of those digital codes that we said before, only it's a private call. It sends it to the repeater and says, hey repeater, what talk group are you on? What reflector are you linked to? If the repeater's linked, it will come back in a deep German accent voice, because DMR Plus is a German product. It'll come back in this deep German accent voice and say, linked to reflector, whatever. If it's not linked to anything, it won't come back in with anything. So then you go down and you say, I want to talk to the DMR Plus Florida reflector. So you switch over to channel 6. You ka-chunk the repeater. The repeater receives from your radio a link command to link to Florida reflector, and then the repeater will send back in a deep German voice, linked to Florida reflector, or whatever verbiage it uses. You switch it back to channel 1, which is talk group 8, and then all the traffic coming into the repeater on talk group 8 goes out to the Florida reflector. Then you're done with your conversation and you want to unlink it, you switch back to channel 3, ka-chunk the repeater gets the signal, says, okay, I'm going to unlink, and it disconnects from Florida and sends you back in a deep German voice, reflector unlinked. It's not hard. It's just lots of steps you have to do, rather than just switch over to Florida on Brandmeister and key up. You have to link and unlink and so forth. Did I lose everybody real quick?
Yeah.
I'm trying to do it.
Okay. I should have drawn a diagram. A reflector is that conference bridge that we talked about before. Traffic coming in on the network goes out then on the network to everything that is attached to it. And so in DMR Plus, we have to link to a reflector, and only one reflector at a time. So you go into your radio and you select the channel that has the link command for the reflector you want to talk to. In this case, let's do Florida. You would switch in your zone for DMR Plus, W4LCO DMR Plus, switching your zone to channel 6. That's the link command for Florida. Ka-chunk it. Just hold the push to talk, release the listen button down for two seconds. And then let go. The repeater sees that signal and then connects through the network, to the Florida reflector. And sends you back a nice deep German voice saying, connected to reflector Florida. And then you switch your radio back to talk group 8, which tells the repeater you're having a conversation on whatever reflector we're linked to, and you have your conversation. Then you switch down to channel 3 to disconnect when you're done. Yes, sir.
Hypothetically, you forget to disconnect, is there a timeout?
Depends.
Or you just lock?
On some reflectors there is and some there isn't.
Does that hold up the rest of the people if you forget to do that? Does that block?
That's why I always say you do the status first. Now, here's the reality of all that I just told you. Most of you aren't going to do it. You're just going to go with the easy and use the Brandmeister. But there's a bunch of reflectors that you could talk to on this repeater that if you don't use DMR Plus, you won't be able to. Now, Tom uses DMR Plus all the time on his hotspot.
Yeah. And, it's late in the afternoon for us, but it's early morning drive time. People in Australia. And I think I can't remember the talk group number, but you get on with those guys. And also, they have their own, they will tell you to go to different channels, just like the TAC channel.
Right.
And they actually respect that, and don't use it for, CQ, block talking. They will actually use their big contact channel, and then they will go to the different channels, and the different channels are somewhat localized, like in Sydney, Perth, another one. And actually started to get friends with some of these people. They're really friendly, and they're not like the English, they're English you can understand.
The point of all that is, though, it's pretty simple to do. It's not as complicated as it seems, right, Tom?
Right.
You link, switch back to talk group 8 and talk. Then you unlink.
And
It's easy. I have a hand over here.
So I'm looking at your handout here, and I'm thumbing through these on my radio, what I'm seeing on my radio is different than.
Yeah.
what I've got.
I created this document a year and a half ago,
Oh, okay.
and we changed them. And we can put more in. This is an example. You obviously go by what's in your radio, but it's the same protocol. Check the status. I told you. Check your status. Link to the talk group or the reflector you want to talk on, and then talk, and then unlink. And there are hundreds of DMR Plus reflectors that you can talk about. All sorts of different geographic locations, all sorts of different interests. There are some interests in, there's a reflector for Raspberry Pi and amateur radio. I've gotten on that a couple of times and had chats with guys talking about how we use our Raspberry Pis and amateur radio.
Is there a website or
Here's where it gets difficult. Getting a compendium of where those are is not that easy. I've been putting them together, and in a couple of weeks, I hope I'll have a nice one that I can put up. I can give the gentleman to put up there a listing of them all. But there's not one great source. It's a big frustration to me. I think the reason is we have some competing interests in DMR Plus. You have Yuli down in Naples and his organization DV4 building all the DV4 minis and DV4 mobiles. They're a big proponent of DMR Plus. It's a European based protocol. But then there's another group that's competing with him for supremacy in that space, and they don't necessarily cooperate with each other. Use the same protocol, but I can't find a place where I can get information on everything on DMR Plus. Brandmeister is pretty good. You can find on brandmeister.net, you can find just about everything you need. DMR Plus is a little bit more spread out. And there's another protocol on the the W4 LCO repeater for DMR, and that's XLX. And you use it exactly the same way as DMR Plus. That's why I didn't put it in the handout. And there are lots of XLX. There are like 700 different XLX reflectors. Questions? I know I've just blown you away, but it's not that hard. And with DMR Plus, you can't launch missiles either.
I'm still having trouble getting that voice to come up with
Um,
I did status and the voice, I don't know that
might not be linked to a reflector. If it's not linked, there won't be a voice. And you have to also make sure that you have talk group 8 in your RX group. Otherwise, you won't hear it.
Yeah, well,
Because it's reporting back on talk group 8.
right, I downloaded it from the website, and then I combined it, I have the, from somebody here, their website. They built this with the hotspot, so I combined it.
At this point, I don't know why you're not hearing the voice. I tested mine just before, and I'm hearing it when I change reflectors. Now, for those of you that have D-Star, and there's a couple of new D-Star users in town, and I hope we get a bunch more, W4LCO also does D-Star. So when you transmit on D-Star, W4LCO says, oh, D-Star, and it gives you D-Star traffic. There's then a wait period after the last traffic. It waits in D-Star mode, or it waits in DMR mode. So if you're having a conversation, a different protocol won't come up in the middle of it. There's I think it's a 15-second delay in D-Star mode or DMR mode before it switches back to listen to both modes. So if you're on D-Star, you can link to whatever reflector you want to link to, and then you can communicate, and you can leave it linked. It comes up linked every day to XRF 757. A lot of times people will change it to the most popular D-Star reflector, which is REF 030 Charlie out of Atlanta. There's hundreds and hundreds of people talking, and you can always find people to talk to. You can talk on 1 Charlie, which is out of Europe. You can talk to people in Europe all day long. It's very simple to use, I think simpler than DMR, but again, full disclosure on prejudice. Any questions? It's 12:02.
So if I'm talking on D-Star, no one can talk on DMR.
That's correct. That's correct. But if you were talking on D-Star to somebody, no one could talk D-Star either, other than getting in the middle of your conversation. So when we first say it, it sounds like, okay, that's limiting the use. But when somebody's talking on the repeater, they're limiting the use anyway. So, yeah. Tom?
Are you gonna do a D-Star program here?
Yeah, we're not prepared to do it today. We're just not enough time, but yeah, I would like to do that.
Where we can actually bring in our radios?
Absolutely. Yeah,
That you're telling us what to do.
Yeah.
Try different things.
absolutely. And $359 for a new ID 51A+2 is not that much money, given the radio that you get. The the W4LCO repeater in D-Star mode also has a bridge to APRS. For those of you that play with APRS, you know the normal convention for APRS is you've got one side of your radio that is set up on the APRS frequency, and every once in a while it has to send out a bunch of AX25 packets and give your location. In D-Star, that happens in the data that's sent while you're transmitting. You don't use another side of the radio. You don't use an extra frequency and extra radio time. In that data packet, it has your call sign, not your 7-digit ID, but your call sign. It has your Latin long, and then the repeater takes that Latin long, strips it out, and sends it to APRS. So you have APRS information on one channel, same as your voice. Much more efficient than the typical APRS display. Other questions, Tom?
Well, you might mention the 31D, UHF's about $100 cheaper.
Yeah, the ID31 is cheaper, but it's only UHF.
But that's what we have here is UHF
In D-Star.
in D-Star.
But it's also an FM radio, and most everything we have in FM is VHF.
Correct. So you can use it for FM and D-Star.
Yeah. Just like your DMR radio, you can use it for FM. And I prefer to carry one handheld, not two. So I have, and it's the ID51 is a true dual receive. You can receive two channels at the same time. The MD380 No, I'm sorry, the GD77 has dual receive, but you can only receive it one channel at a time. So I can listen to say the 345 and the D-Star repeater at the same time. Separate volume controls. Makes it very nice. But this is not a commercial Friday, sorry. Other questions? Okay, 1 o'clock is W9 GPI Steve on Wires X. Yaesu Systems Fusion entrance into the networking protocol for digital voice. Thank you. Yeah, take the first. We have one more research. But I couldn't get the program out. I don't know what's going on. Yes, we do. We're gonna work on it. You still got your D-Star radio? Hang on.
Let's put more money. They're small.